Welcome to the Antioch University Santa Barbara Writing Center Understanding APA workshop. This part is APA Format Part 1 in-text citations. This is part of a 5-video series where in 3 videos I talk about parts of APA style, and in these last 2 videos I'll talk about APA format. For an overview of today's video, I'm going to be talking about in-text citation format, and specifically I'll talk about the differences between that for quotes and paraphrases and how it depends on the number of authors of the source that you're citing. I'll also talk about how to format block quotes, that's quotes of 40 words or longer. I'll talk about indirect citations or citations of secondary sources, how to cite multiple sources for one idea or finding. We'll do a practice activity where we spot the formatting errors. And last, I'll wrap up with something that happens a little less often, but quotes that contain in-text citations and how to deal with those. So to format an in-text citation for quotes, you need to use a signal phrase. And basically what that is the last name of the author and the year. And this kind of introduces the quote. And it also tells the readers the author and date. APA is an author date system where they really care about the date or the year of publication. After a direct quote, you need to include a page number in parentheses. So here it's page 5, P period space and a 5. Or if you're citing something from a range of pages, then you write PP period space and the page range, and this means pages 5 through 7. If you're citing an article that does not have page numbers, like sometimes an article on a website won't have page numbers, then you should still use some kind of locator for the specific quote when you're doing a direct quote. So here you could put a paragraph number, or you could put like the heading of a section if it's too many paragraphs to count, but some kind of locator inside the text for a direct quote is required. For a summary or paraphrase, you have 2 options. So just like with a quote, you can start off with the signal phrase, the author name and year, or you can do the second option where you kind of continue to talk about the information from the source. Hopefully you've already introduced it with this kind of signal phrase in an earlier sentence, and now you're continuing to paraphrase or summarize information from that source by just dropping it in and starting your sentence with that information. Then you can put the entire citation into parentheses at the end of the sentence. So in this case, you put the author name and the year in the parentheses. The page number here is optional for a summary or paraphrase. In APA, you should use a page number for these if one is available. I kind of think of it like this. Here I'm citing a very specific fact about sibutramine, so I probably do want to include the page number where I found that fact. But if I'm summarizing a 20-page article by writing, this article found a correlation between A and B, and talking about the content on all 20 pages, then maybe I won't include a page number for that, but just the author and year. So for work with 2 authors, you've already seen an example of this. You want to name both authors every time you cite the work, but you have to write the "and" differently depending on how you cite it. So if you're using a signal phrase, the author names and year in the sentence, and the way I remember it is if the author's names are words in the sentence, then the word "and" is also written out like a word, A-N-D. But if the author names are not words in the sentence, and the "and" is not a word in the sentence because they're all stuffed into the parentheses at the end of the sentence, then you use the ampersand symbol here instead of writing out the word "and." Also, for works with 3 or more authors, this is a much easier rule now to remember in APA 7th edition compared to those of you who might remember the rules from the earlier 6th edition of APA. For 3 or more authors, you always use the first author's last name and et al. So here we have the first author's name, Berkowitz et al. Et al is an abbreviation for et alia, meaning and others. Et just means and in Latin, so it doesn't have a period for an abbreviation, but the all does. So what you're basically saying here is Berkowitz and others concluded that. It's kind of like saying they. Also, you should note that the authors' names are not in alphabetical order when you're listing the authors' names on publication. Instead, they're ordered by who did the most work and gets the most credit. So that's why you always want to use the first author's last name with et al., even if that's not the first alphabetical last name. The alphabetical order doesn't matter here. It's whoever name is first is the author who did the most work and gets the most credit. For long quotations, these are quotations of 40 words or more. You want to format them like block quotes, where you indent the whole thing by ½ an inch. Everything is double spaced in your APA paper, including block quotes. The difference here is that these quotes don't have any quotation marks before and after because the indent itself is showing that they're a quote. Also, the page number goes outside of the period instead of inside. That's the only other main difference. And make sure not to pad your papers with long quotes. Don't use too many of these. They're really visible and noticeable. And sometimes it makes sense to use a block quote, of course, occasionally. But also think about, if you want to quote all of this content in your paper, think about if it needs to be all together like that as a block quote, or if you could split it up by using some quote sandwiches, like I talked about in the last video, APA style part 3 integrating source material. You can use a quote sandwich by introducing part of the quote, then using a shorter part of the quote, then adding your own explanation or analysis or commentary on the quote. So you could break this up into 2 or 3 little quote sandwiches that just go inside your normal paragraph instead of formatting it as a big visible block quote that takes up a lot of room in your paper. So next I'm going to talk about indirect citations, and these can be pretty tricky. For example, if you're reading a book by Nicholson and Nicholson talks about something Allport says, but you didn't actually go read the book by Allport, but you want to cite Allport's words or ideas. You can do that by using something called as cited in, an indirect citation. But just make sure take it slow and do it one step at a time, where the first thing you want to make sure is that you're writing a really clear signal phrase that shows whose words or ideas it actually is. So here's my signal phrase: Allport's diary demonstrated that. Or I could say Allport demonstrated that. That's my signal phrase. And then my citation, instead of putting the year of Allport's book's publication, I did not go find Allport's book. I did not read Allport's book. I was only learning about this from Nicholson's book. So I need to use the words as cited in. And here I have Nicholson and the year of publication for the Nicholson book, 2003. So you want to use this sparingly. Like, this makes sense to use as cited in when that original work, Allport, is out of print or very difficult to access or not available in English or another language that you can read. But if you do try to track down the original source of Allport's diary and you can't find it, you can't access it, then it's okay to do this sometimes. Another time when it's okay to do this is when a source includes a quote from an interview. So for example, here I'm citing a quote from President Obama from a New York Times article. The New York Times article was written by Baker in 2013, so that's the name of the journalist. And in this case, I can't go track down President Obama. Unfortunately, I don't know him personally, and I can't say, President Obama, did you really say this? So instead, I'm kind of taking Baker's word for it and saying as cited in Baker and the year publication of that article. And that's the same thing up here. I have to kind of trust Nicholson and take Nicholson's word for it that that's what Allport actually said. So that's additionally why it's important to cite the source where you found the information. One last thing to know about this kind of reference is that you should include only the source you read, so only the Nicholson reference, not the Allport reference, in your references list at the end. Or here I would include only Baker 2013 in my references list, but not mention President Obama in my references list, because that's the only source you actually referred to in your research. Okay, there's another type of in-text citation called personal communication. This would be when you want to cite information from like a phone call, email, interview, or conversation with someone. These also should not be included in your references list because these are not publicly retrievable sources. If it's like a private email or a phone call that you had with one other person, no one else will be able to find that online or anywhere. So you can still cite sources like that. You include the author's or the source's first initial and last name. So this is one of the only times where you'll be using someone's first initial in your writing. Usually we use only author last names in our writing, and we include the first initials only in the references page at the end. But for personal communication, you do the first initial last name, write the words personal communication, and then write the specific date. Here's with a signal phrase, Lou suggested that. Or you can also do parenthetical style where you include the information they told you, and then in parentheses write their name, there should be a comma here, personal communication, and the date. We also get a lot of questions in the Writing Center about citing lecture notes and slides. So if your instructor does publish their slides online, then you can cite, the instructor name and date and put in brackets lecture notes or lecture slides, and include a URL for where that can be found. If they're putting those slides on Sakai or something that requires a login, then the URL should be the login page to Sakai. But you can still cite slides or something that's on Sakai. If they're not retrievable at all, though, then you can just cite your information that you got from a lecture or from slides as personal communication with your professor's first initial and last name. And then you would not include it in your references list. So what do you do when a fact or idea can be found in several different sources? Like you're not sure which one gets the credit for it. So actually you can cite more than one source in the same set of parentheses. This is especially useful in like a literature review for a master's thesis or dissertation. So here, several studies have identified a positive correlation between meditation and stress reduction. Then I'm actually citing 4 different sources or 4 different articles. You can tell because there's 4 different years of publication. And here what we have is different sets of authors that are separated using semicolons. So we have Adams et al. Is one set of authors, semicolon, Shumway and Schulman is another set of authors, and they wrote publications in both of these years that showed this positive correlation. Then a semicolon and a last set of authors, one author, Westinghouse. In this case, you want to list all those authors in alphabetical order, the same order they'll appear in your references. And one reason for doing this is not just to show, look how much research I did, look how many other sources I found, but also, especially in a literature review section, to show your readers like this finding has weight and has been recognized by many people. So it kind of makes it a stronger, more credible finding if many people in the literature have found something similar, or to show that many people in your field think something is worth studying or have kind of shared the same idea about something. Those are all good reasons to include multiple sources for one piece of information. So to sum up, when you're citing a quotation, you want to include a signal phrase like including the author name and year of publication. then you'll include the quotation, then the page number in parentheses before the period. Or if your sentence keeps going after the quote, here we have the author name and year, then the quote, then we'll put the page number in parentheses right after the quote, even though it's not at the end of the sentence yet. Here I'm adding my own kind of explanation or analysis, the second half of my quote sandwich, in the same sentence. So the page number doesn't go at the end of the sentence, instead it goes right after the end of the quote. And when you're citing a summary or paraphrase, you have two options. You can also do a signal phrase where you introduce the paraphrase with the author name and year, or you can kind of drop it in, start off your sentence with the content you're talking about. This is not good to do with a quote, but it's fine to do with a summary or paraphrase. And in this case, in the citation, you put it all into parentheses at the end, author name, comma, year, comma, page number. So now we're going to do some practice where we try to find what's wrong with the in-text citation formatting. And for some of the things that you're going to have to know to format your citations correctly, you'll want to refer to the last video right before this, APA Style Part 3 Integrating Source Material, but I'll review some of those things here as well. There are 5 things wrong with this formatting. So you might want to pause the video here and try to find all of them and take your time. And I'll go ahead and show you. First, you don't need to include the title of journals or articles or books in APA in your writing. All of those should go onto your references page at the end of the paper, but in your writing, you just need the author, last name, and the year. That's it. So that's a hint already that we don't need the author first initials here. Those also only go on your references page. And then we actually have 3 or more authors here. We have 3, so we don't actually need to include all of them. We can just do the first one's last name, Hayes et al. If we did only have 2 authors, this would be the wrong way to write and. Instead of the ampersand symbol, we should write it and, like the word. And the last mistake is that the verb investigate should be past tense in APA to describe author action. So here we have Hayes et al., 1 author, and et al. To show there's 3 or more authors, and then the year, and then investigated past tense. So that other information, the name of the journal, the name of the article as well, the names of the other authors and their first initials will all be on the references page at the end. Let's do one more practice to see what's wrong with this in-text citation formatting. So take a moment, pause the video if you'd like. There are actually 3 mistakes here. So pause the video, see if you can find them, and take your time. And I will show you the mistakes. So here are the 3 mistakes. When there's 2 authors and they're used as words in the sentence, then and should be spelled out instead of using the ampersand symbol. Also, the year should always stick together with the name. So the year should be up here in parentheses, 2000. And we didn't need 2 P's here because it's not a range of pages. It's only 1 page, 402. So we just need 1 P. So the correct version would look like this. And is spelled out, and here is the year, and 1 P for the page number. But also, because this is a paraphrase rather than a direct quote, you also have the option to kind of just rewrite a little and put all the citation information in parentheses at the end here. And here we just started with people diagnosed with. In this case, you do want the ampersand symbol because the names are in parentheses rather than words in your sentence. And you do keep the year here in this case because the year always sticks together with the author name. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is something that happens a little bit less often. If you want to quote something that itself contains a citation, here are some options. I'm going to give you 2 approaches for this. First of all, here's an example from Pinero et al. 2016, where Pinero's sentence includes this citation from Stanislavski, 1936. So there's 2 approaches. The first one is just try to avoid quoting that part of the text, right? Like you could paraphrase that instead, or you could quote just shorter phrases, not that entire sentence, like not the part with the citation. Here is an example where you could quote the phrase become immersed and quote the phrase calls for absorption. So here, have observed the need for actors to become immersed. This act of becoming immersed calls for absorption. In both cases, we're quoting Panero, and we've avoided the issue of Stanislavski 1936 being in there in the original Panero. But here's the second approach. If it's really necessary to quote an embedded quote, you can include that in-text citation that's in the quote, like this. So here I'm quoting that whole thing, and that part is actually included inside the quote. But you do not include that source in the references because you did not refer to that source yourself. You only referred to Panero et al. 2016. The last kind of option, if the citations are at the end of the material you want to quote, you do have the option of ending your quote before the citations and only citing the work you read. So for example, here's a long paragraph that's from this source, Killam et al. 2018. And you can see at the end of this paragraph, Killam et al. Is citing, for example, all of these different sources. So Killam et al. Got their information from all of these different sources. If you would like, you have the option to, quote, obviously you can paraphrase as well, but if you want to quote Killam et al., just end your quote here with leadership skills. So through the satisfaction of psychological needs, blah, 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 interpersonal and leadership skills, end your quote here before this in-text citation would occur, and then you can cite Killam et al. So that's okay to do. Of course, your reader can go find Killam et al. And then see where they got their information. As I talked about in the last video, everyone's getting information from everywhere else, and you just want to make sure you're giving credit in the proper ways. So thank you for watching. This was APA Format Part 1 in-text citations. Check out our other videos. We had 3 videos on APA style, thesis statements, reducing bias, and integrating source material. And we'll have 1 more video on APA format, which will be Part 2, references and document format. Also, all of our APA resources can be found online on the AUSB Writing Center website. We have an APA example paper, as well as sources that help you format in-text citations and references, some about signal phrases, and some templates for setting up your APA paper document. If you're an AUSB Santa Barbara student, you can find the AUSB Writing Center website from your AU Direct portal. And again, here is the list of some of the resources that we have there.